On July 16, 1996, Susan Walsh, 36 years old, needed to make a phone call. Lacking a phone of her own, she intended to use a payphone a block away from her apartment in Nutley, New Jersey, as she often did. Around noon, she left and informed her estranged husband, Mark Walsh, that she was stepping out. Mark lived in an adjacent apartment to where Susan lived with their 12-year-old son, but Susan did not come back. Mark reported her missing, and a day or two later, the police conducted a search of her home. They didn't find anything indicating a crime had occurred there, and no one saw Susan leave her home or use the payphone that day. In fact, no outgoing calls were made from any other payphones near her apartment on the morning she went missing. There was one thing in the apartment that caught the attention of the police, though in her wall calendar, the month of July had been torn out. To Detective Lieutenant Stephen Rogers of the Nutley Police Department, the missing month is a mysterious clue in Susan's disappearance. "To me, that's significant," he said. "Did she have something planned on that someone didn't want us to see?" Susan had been juggling a lot in the months leading up to her disappearance. She was a freelance journalist for the New York Weekly, The Village Voice, and was working on her master's degree in writing at New York University. She also occasionally worked as an exotic dancer at the clubs around New Jersey for extra money, which she'd done on and off since college. According to Susan's father, she struggled to leave behind the easy money that came with dancing. Even though she aspired to be a full-time writer, she did it to earn some extra money and support her and her son. And it was also where she got a lot of information for her stories. One of her recent articles had garnered a lot of attention. It was an expose in the Village Voice about the Russian mob, who allegedly forced female immigrants to work in strip clubs for them. Susan's father, Floyd Merchant, believes the article opened up a threat to her. Friends say Susan was getting more and more paranoid, telling people she was being targeted by mobsters and stalkers. She believed 2 contracts had been taken out to kill her. She feared for her life and started drinking again after over a decade of sobriety, and stopped taking the medication she was on to stabilize her mental health. "The last time I met her, she was worried about someone having her killed. She was coming apart at the seams," said her father. Susan was also working as a researcher on the book titled Red Light: Inside the Sex Industry. The book was co-authored by her mentor at the Village Voice, James Ridgway, and focused on the corruption and criminal activity in the industry. She had also written an article for the Village Voice about the underground vampire scene in Manhattan. She was led to the story after she received a tip about blood going missing from NYC hospitals. Susan became immersed in the underground subculture, even reportedly dating a man who believed he was a vampire. She wrote a follow-up piece on the topic, but it was rejected because, according to Ridgway, Susan got totally absorbed with the vampire thing, the theories, the energy flows. Some suspect that her disappearance is related to the article and its subjects. However, there's no evidence to support that theory. In 1996, Susan was interviewed for a documentary about exotic dancers called Stripped. In the interview, she spoke about how she had become disenchanted by the industry. When her beeper goes off, she laughs and says, "It must be my stalker." Then her tone turns more serious as she says, "No, I do have a stalker." 2 days later, she went missing. Susan's father suspects that the police initially discredited Susan's case because she was an exotic dancer. At one point, police suspected that she left voluntarily. Her father never believed that theory, especially because she left everything behind: her purse, pager, keys, medication, and most importantly, her son. He says Susan was a devoted mother who never would have abandoned her child. Stephen Rogers doesn't believe there's a connection between Susan's death and the mob story she published. However, foul play is suspected. Her estranged husband, Mark Walsh, was never considered a suspect in the case. Police say Susan's case has been especially difficult to investigate because so many people who were in her life when she went missing have either died or couldn't be reached. They're still searching for a person of interest who they believe have information about Susan's disappearance and ask anyone with information to reach out to the police department in New Jersey. November 24, 1998 was a long day of work for Noriko Tushide. The 24-year-old was an editing reporter for Ail Shima, a community magazine in my prefecture, Japan. She had just returned from a trip to Thailand the day before and didn't leave the office until 11 p.m. Unfortunately, Noriko never made it home to her family. They started to worry and reported her missing when her car was discovered the next morning. It was located in a parking lot 1 kilometer from her work, but her bag and keys were nowhere to be found. Inside the car, police found cigarette butts, even though Noriko didn't smoke, and the driver's seat was pushed back, much further back than Noriko would typically have it set. The Mie Prefectural Police initially treated it as a runaway case, but her family believed she was a victim of foul play and that she wouldn't have run off on her own accord. The police eventually opened an official investigation into Noriko's disappearance, and 80 police officers searched the area surrounding her work, which included a wooded area and a lake. Investigators also questioned approximately 700 people in connection to Noriko's disappearance, but they didn't establish any leads. A former detective said that he was suspicious of the case from the beginning. The parking lot where Noriko's car had been found belonged to an insurance company, and it wasn't where she usually parked. Her car was also parked diagonally, which he found strange. There was one person of interest identified in the case, a man who Noriko previously interviewed for the magazine. He'd called her 4 times the day she went missing. The man was questioned by police, and he admitted to seeing her on the night of November 24th. According to him, they'd met to discuss the previous interview. He picked her up and they talked in his car, and then he dropped her off where her car was later found, but he said that he didn't know what happened to her after that. In 2008, rumors began to circulate that Noriko had been kidnapped and taken to North Korea. According to a government official, they had a source who specifically named Noriko as someone who may have been abducted and taken to the country. The Mie Prefectural Police then reinvestigated her case to look into the claim. A government official said, "It's strange that a person from a third country would know the name of a person who is not designated as an abductee or a missing person. This claim has yet to be confirmed by police." For years, Noriko's family and friends would meet on the anniversary of her disappearance and distribute flyers with her photos in hopes that it would help them find her. Right now, it is still unknown how and why she disappeared 20 years ago. For many residents of Mason City, Iowa, Judy Husentrout was a familiar face. She was a news anchor for the Kim TV, and they saw her almost every morning when she hosted the 6 o'clock morning news. But on June 27, 1995, she running late. Typically, Jody would arrive at the station around 3 a.m., but by 4 a.m., there was no sign of Jody, so her producer, Amy Coons, gave her a call. Jody answered her phone. She had slept in but would be right there. Since she lived just 5 minutes away from the station, it wouldn't take her long. According to Amy, Jody seemed normal during their call. But when 5 a.m. hit and Jody still wasn't at work, Amy called again, but this time there was no answer. Instead, she anchored the 6 a.m. show herself and asked a co-worker to call the police and request a welfare check on Jody. At 7:16 a.m., the police arrived at Jody's apartment complex and realized a crime had occurred in the parking lot. Jody's red Mazda Miata was still there, and there were signs of a struggle around it. They could see drag marks on the wet pavement, and they found her bent car key nearby along with her red high heels, blow dryer, and earrings. Search teams combed through the surrounding area, but didn't find anything else. Police believe Jody was abducted from our parking lot of our apartment between 4 and 4:30 a.m. There were no signs that Jody or her abductor entered her car, but they found a partial palm print on the vehicle. When police searched our apartment, they noticed the toilet seat was lifted, which suggested to them that a man was the last one to use it. While police were investigating the scene, Jody's friend, John Vickice, was walking by and started talking with the police. He told them that he saw Jody the night before. She had been at his house to watch a video of her surprise 27th birthday party, which he'd hosted for her earlier that month. He'd also spent the weekend prior with her and a few other friends water skiing in Iowa City. John was 22 years older than Jody, and although friends believed he was interested in her, she denied being romantically involved with him. When police asked him about his whereabouts that morning, John said that he was home and had his friend LaDonna call him around 6 a.m. to confirm their morning walk, which she confirmed. He provided a palm print and was given a polygraph test, though the results of both were never released. Police also interviewed Jody's neighbors, who reported hearing a scream around 4:30 a.m. Since the apartment complex was next to a busy campsite, the residents shrugged the scream off as noisy campers and didn't report it to the police. A neighbor also reported seeing a light-colored van in the apartment parking lot early that morning, but the vehicle was never discovered. The police also considered how Jody's job might have played a part in her disappearance since she was in the public eye. On October 8th, she called the police after being followed by someone in a white truck while she was out for a run. She began taking self-defense classes and told her instructor that she thought she was being followed. The day before her disappearance, she was at an awards dinner at the Mason City Country Club. She talked with some guests and mentioned that she needed to change her phone number as she was getting nasty and naughty phone calls, but didn't share any further details about who they were from. With no solid evidence or leads, Jody's case went cold. On May of 2001, she was declared legally dead by a judge. On the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, her friends created Jody's Network of Hope, a nonprofit that hosts an annual golf tournament in Long Prairie to honor Jody and raise safety awareness. In 2020, drug kingpin Dustin Honkin, who is awaiting execution for killing 5 people in the 90s, was suggested as a suspect. Some speculated that he and his accomplice, Angela Johnson, were involved in Jody's disappearance. Johnson previously worked at the Mason City Country Club as a server where Jody was seen the night before she went missing. Johnson stated that she wasn't working that night, which was corroborated by a server who knew Johnson and was working at the time. No evidence has been found to concretely connect Dustin Honkin or Angela Johnson to Jody's disappearance. In late 2020, a private investigator named Stephen Ridge announced that someone interviewed by police at the time of Jody's disappearance confessed to him that they destroyed potential key evidence in the case. He'd been in touch with federal authorities and had passed the information along to them in hopes that it was pivotal information they need to open the case. Though the informant and potential evidence has not been revealed, the Mason City Police Department is still currently investigating Jody's disappearance, with help from the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation and the FBI. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On October 18, 1983, a middle-aged couple foraged for mushrooms in Lake Village, Indiana, when they stumbled upon an abandoned farm. There, they found shallow graves containing the bodies of 4 young men who had been drugged and stabbed. 2 of the men were quickly identified as Michael Bauer and John Bartlett, but the identities of the other 2 remained unknown. They became known as Brad Doe and Adam Doe, or the Newton County John Does. Adam Doe was a young black man estimated to be between 15 and 18 years old. He had died sometime between 1982 and 1983 and still has yet to be identified. Brad Doe was described as a Caucasian male between 17 and 23 years old, who died between the years of 1981 and 1983. While it would take years for Brad Doe to be identified, it didn't take as long to identify his murderer as serial killer Larry Eiler. Also known as the Highway Killer or the Interstate Killer, Eiler was already in police custody as a suspect in a series of murders when Brad Doe's body was discovered. Eiler died in prison in 1994 from AIDS-related complications while on death row for the murder of 15-year-old Danny Bridges. In a posthumous confession, it was revealed that Eiler murdered at least 21 young men. Years passed without any successful leads on Brad Doe's identity. Then, in 2019, the Newton County Coroner's Office and Rebecca Goddard, the Newton County Chief Deputy Prosecutor, reached out to the nonprofit DNA Doe Project for assistance. They worked with the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification to obtain a DNA extraction from the unidentified remains. They then ran a family reference samples comparison on the DNA, which compares the DNA against DNA samples provided by the family members of missing people. In January of 2021, Brad Doe's DNA sample was sent off to Hudson Alpha Discovery for more genome sequencing. And in March of 2021, SABR Investigations began their bioinformatics work. They developed a DNA profile to upload to GeneMatch, a website used for genetic genealogy research, and found a potential match. To confirm the match, investigators connected with Brad Doe's possible relatives who voluntarily submitted their DNA samples to the database. It was a 99.59% match. After over 37 years, the Newton County Coroner's Office was finally able to identify Brad Doe by his true name, John Ingram Brandenburg Jr. John, often called Johnny by his mother, went missing from Chicago, Illinois in 1983 and was 19 years old at the time of his death. The last time his family saw him, he was leaving their home to visit a friend. Rebecca Goddard, the Newton County Chief Deputy Prosecutor involved in the case, said, "While my heart breaks for this family, I'm thankful that they finally have some of the answers they've waited so long for, and I hope this brings them peace." In early September 1985, a bear hunter in Missoula County, Montana, came across the skeletal remains of a woman. When police arrived on the scene, they couldn't find any clothing or personal items in the area that could help identify her, but they determined that she had died from 2 gunshot wounds and had been deceased for about a year. The unidentified woman was then referred to as the Christie Crystal Creek due to the crime scene's close proximity to Crystal Creek. Throughout the years, the case was investigated by the Missoula County Sheriff's Office and armchair detectives alike, drawing attention due to its possible connection to serial killer Wayne Nance, who operated in the area during that time. The police spent years working with a forensic anthropologist and a forensic odontologist to solve the case. They also searched through missing person databases in the US and Canada, but they could never identify her. Then, in early 2001, the Missoula County Sheriff's Office received financial assistance from the Montana Department of Justice's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. They then joined together with Ortham Labs to conduct a forensic genealogy investigation into the remains, which determined that they belonged to someone from the Lucas family tree in Spokane, Washington. After several interviews, they confirmed their identification by DNA testing several of the Lucas family members. Finally, they were able to positively identify Christie Crystal Creek Doe as 23-year-old Jeanette Lee Lucas. Jeanette was a mother from Spokane, Washington. She had been missing for years and was last seen in Idaho in the summer of 1983. Her son, who was 5 years old at the time of his mother's disappearance, had dedicated much of his adult life to finding her. In a news release in May 2021, Detective Captain Dave Conway with the Missoula County Sheriff's Office said, "We cannot rest on our success of having finally identified Jeanette. We must now seek justice for Jeanette. Our focus has changed from who is Christie Crystal Creek to what happened to Jeanette Lucas." Detective Marta Timmons says Jeanette could have been a victim of serial killer Wayne Nance, as she was found in an area he often hung out in. Nance was known as the Missoula Mauler during the 1970s-80s. He is believed to have killed 6 people, though he was never convicted of his crimes, as he was killed in 1986 after attacking a couple in their home. He was shot during the attack and died in the hospital on September 4, 1986. Jeanette's remains were found near other Jane Does, Debbie Deer Creek, who was later identified as 16-year-old Marcella Sherry Bachman, and Betty Beavertail, later identified as 15-year-old Devina Nelson. Both were victims of Nance. Police are currently investigating Jeanette's death. While she was found in Montana, she did not live there and there were no records of her visiting there. They have shared a picture of Jeanette with the public in hopes that someone may have seen or known her in the summer of 1983 to 1984. They are investigating all new information as well as evidence and reports from Nance's case files to confirm if there's a link to Jeanette's murder. Jeanette's family released a statement of her case saying, not only was she a mother, but she was also a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a friend, and now a grandmother to 4 beautiful children. We are grateful to finally be able to bring her home to us as well as bring Jeanette the peace and rest she so deserves. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. The Kern County Jane Doe was found on July 15, 1980 in a Kern County almond orchard just north of Bakersfield, California. Police determined that she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death the day prior. In a description of the victim, police said that she was either Hispanic or Native American with shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, and colored tattoos, which were uncommon for women at the time. The Kern County Sheriff's Office suspected that their Jane Doe might have been picked up at a nearby bar in Lemoore called Ruby's, which was 75 miles from where she was found. Police began investigating the Jane Doe case immediately, collecting her fingerprints and looking into who she could be. But since they couldn't find any information on her and never received an inquiry connected to her, her case went cold for decades. Then in 2013, DNA from underneath Kern County Jane's fingernails were matched to serial killer Wilson Shoist, who was already serving a life sentence in prison for robbery, kidnapping, and rape. Shouse was also matched to a Ventura County Jane Doe who was found in a high school parking lot in Thousand Oaks, California within a few days of the Kern County Jane Doe. In 2018, Shouse was convicted of the 2 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Senior Deputy District Attorney John Barak said, "It never really mattered to me that we didn't know their identity. What we could prove absolutely is that they were people, and I think this is just another example of why, regardless of whether or not you know the identity of the victims, they were still victims. Victims of a horrible crime, and they died in a horrible way all alone, and no one knew, and those investigators never gave up." Ventura County then reached out to the Kern County and suggested looking for a genealogy match for their Jane Doe. The Kern County Sheriff's Coroner Division Chief, Don Ratliff, contacted the DNA Doe Project for assistance with the case, requesting genetic genealogy research to identify the woman. Genealogy work officially began in May of 2019, and although the Kern County Jane Doe's DNA had broken down over the years, they were able to find usable DNA data and upload the DNA profile to GEDmatch. Through their research, they determined that Jane Doe was a descendant of the Indigenous First Nations people of Canada, likely from the Cree Nation in Alberta, Manitoba, or Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, First Nations people are very underrepresented in most DNA databases, making it even more difficult for missing people within their community to be identified. To help in their research, a composite photo of the Kern County Jane Doe and details on our Cree Nation origins were shared as part of a Facebook campaign by the DNA Doe Project. A family member recognized the photo, and after reading about her likely origins as a First Nations people, they knew exactly who it was. The woman, Violet Susie, knew it was her Aunt Shirley and Susie. She had been searching for her for nearly 40 years. Violet said that her aunt was very meticulous and was a creature of habit. She would send them Christmas and birthday cards every year until 1980, when they suddenly stopped. Her grandmother told her that something must have happened and that they had to go and look for her. They searched hospitals, bars, parks, and graveyards over several years, but found nothing. When Violet's mother fell ill, she was ready to take a break from looking for her Aunt Shirley. But then, just a few days later, she saw the composite photo on Facebook. She then connected with the DNA Doe Project, and they were able to use her DNA and genetic genealogy to confirm a match. Violet had promised Shirley's biological mother that she'd keep looking for Shirley and bring her home, and she did. On April 23, 2021, during the Crimes Victims' Rights Week, the Kern County Sheriff's Coroner and the DNA Doe Project publicly announced they'd identified the Kern County Jane Doe as Shirley and Susie. According to the DNA Doe Project, Shirley was one of the first Indigenous does to be identified using genetic genealogy. On the success of the case, Chief Coroner Ratliff said, "This is not about solving crime, although it may be a byproduct. This was about finding a family who had missed her, but did not know where to look." For now, the search for Ventura County's Jane Doe identity continues. According to the information given to law enforcement, the Ventura County Jane Doe was hitchhiking near the College of the Sequoias and was abducted in Visalia, California. The DNA Doe Project and law enforcement are hopeful that they'll soon be able to give her back her name. Angie Ray Dodge came into the world on December 21, 1977. She was the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter of Jack Roger Dodge and Carol Dodge. Angie was a force to be reckoned with from the very beginning, and those who knew her couldn't help but be struck by her intelligence, stubbornness, and no-nonsense attitude. As her best friend, Jessica Martinez, put it, she didn't put up with people's crap. As May of 1996 rolled around, Angie found herself at a crossroads. She was 18, fresh out of Idaho Falls School and itching for independence. She was determined to start the next chapter of her life on her own terms. So during the third week of the month, Angie packed her bags and moved out of her family home. She and her mother had also at some point disagreed over a house rule, and this had hastened Angie's decision to move out. Her new abode was a cozy apartment on the second floor of a weathered building located at 4441 I Street in Idaho Falls. Despite the inevitable challenges that come with living alone for the first time, Angie quickly settled into her new routine. By day, she worked at a beauty store in downtown Idaho Falls where she charmed her customers with her friendly demeanor and impeccable makeup skills. And by night, she returned to her apartment where she reveled in her newfound independence. 3 weeks had passed since Angie left her family home, but the distance between her and her mother was beginning to weigh on her. And so on the evening of June 12, 1996, Angie decided to pay her mother a visit. When Carol opened the door, Angie greeted her with a kiss, and for a moment all the past disagreements were forgotten. Mother and daughter embraced, rocking back and forth in each other's arms. As they caught up, Angie confided in her mother the hardships of growing up and living alone. After a pleasant evening, Angie bid her mother farewell and blew her a kiss as she drove away. Little did Carol know that it would be the last time she would see her daughter alive. She had no idea of the events that were about to unfold, events that would shatter her world and leave her grieving for years to come. The morning of June 13, 1996 began like any other day for two colleagues of Angie. Simply identified as Julia and Tawny, a few minutes before 11 a.m., the pair arrived at Angie's apartment concerned that she had failed to show up for her shift at the beauty store. As they knocked on her front door, a sense of unease settled over them. When Angie didn't answer, they let themselves in. The silence inside was deafening. The girls searched every room until they reached the bedroom, and that's when their worst fears were realized. Angie was lying on the floor, a blood-stained sheet covering the mattress beside her. Her throat was slit and her body was riddled with over a dozen puncture wounds. It was a sight that no one should ever have to witness. Julia and Tawny were left reeling at the gruesome sight before them. Authorities were summoned to the scene, and soon, the apartment was teeming with detectives determined to get to the bottom of the heinous crime. Despite the chaos, the detectives combed the scene with a hawkish eye, searching for clues to lead them to Angie's killer. They noticed a lack of forced entry, and this suggested that the perpetrator was probably known to Angie. They wasted no time in collecting her bedding and clothing, eager to send them off to the Idaho State Crime Lab for testing. Meanwhile, Angie's body was also taken away for an autopsy. The autopsy revealed the brutal truth about Angie's death. She had been stabbed and cut 14 times. Her killer's DNA was found on her body. Investigators were able to determine that Angie was killed between 12:45 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. on the day her lifeless body was discovered. The news of Angie's death spread like wildfire, and people were left reeling with disbelief and anger. Her family was left heartbroken and inconsolable, struggling to come to terms with a devastating loss. The question on everyone's mind was who could have committed such a heinous crime against a young, innocent woman in a town where everyone knew each other and crime was rare. This kind of violence was unprecedented. The people demanded answers, and they wanted them immediately. The Idaho Falls Police Department detectives assigned to the case didn't waste any time and immediately launched an investigation into Angie's murder. They knocked on doors and interviewed neighbors, friends, family members, and colleagues hoping to find some information that could lead to the killer. The department also took DNA samples from dozens of men and compared it to the DNA found on the scene and on Angie's body, but there were no matches. The complexity and high-profile nature of the case seemed to overwhelm the department, and weeks after Angie's killing, there were still no clear leads. Frustration was starting to build and the case seemed to be going nowhere. Feeling helpless and frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation, Angie's mother, Carol, decided to take matters into her own hands. She distributed thousands of flyers, offering a $5,000 reward for tips, but the response was minimal. Undeterred, she took to patrolling the streets until the early hours, asking anyone who would listen if they had information about her daughter's death. Carol was determined to find justice for her daughter no matter what it took. The investigation into Angie's murder seemed to have hit a dead end until one day, the detectives got a break in the case. On January 5, 1997, 7 long months after Angie's murder, a man named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested. He had been caught taking advantage of a woman at knife point in Nevada, and detectives couldn't help but notice the similarities between his crime and Angie's murder. As detectives dug deeper into his background, they found out that Benjamin was also from Idaho Falls and knew Angie through a group of young people called the River Rats. This group frequently hung out by the trails along a river not far from Angie's apartment. Angie also frequented the river, and the group knew her well. With all of the pieces coming together, it wasn't long before Benjamin became the prime suspect in Angie's case. Detectives began building a case against him and even brought in another of his friends, 20-year-old Christopher Tapp, for questioning. As it happened, Tapp was Benjamin's best friend, and detectives hoped that he might be able to provide valuable information. When Tapp was interrogated on January 7, 1997, he initially denied any involvement in the crime. He told detectives he had been with a girl on the night Angie was murdered and that Benjamin was not involved either. However, the detectives believed there was more to the story. During his second interview, just a few days later on January 10, 1997, Tapp changed his story and admitted that Benjamin had killed Angie and had asked him to provide an alibi. But the detectives weren't satisfied. They pushed Tapp further. And on January 15, 1997, his story took yet another turn. This time, Tapp claimed that he had been with Benjamin when Angie was killed. Between January 15-17, 1997, Tapp entered into a series of immunity agreements with prosecutors. He agreed to provide truthful information about the crime in return for a lesser charge of aiding and abetting an aggravated battery. But just when the detectives thought they had cracked the case, a new development surfaced. DNA tests had come back and confirmed that neither Benjamin nor Tapp was the source of the DNA found on Angie's body and clothes. The detectives were stumped, and it was at this point that Tapp came up with a new name, Jeremy Sargas, who was a friend of both Tapp and Benjamin. Tapp now accused both Benjamin and Jeremy of Angie's murder, saying they had taken advantage of her and killed her. It seemed like the case was getting even more complicated. As the investigation dragged on, Tapp's credibility was hanging by a thread. The authorities had used every tool at their disposal, from endless interrogations to multiple lie detector tests. And now they were running out of patience. On January 27th, the DNA results on Jeremy also came back negative, proving that he had no involvement in Angie's murder. This was a major setback for the prosecution, adding insult to injury. Sargas' alibi had checked out, leaving prosecutors with no one else to turn to. In a fit of rage, prosecutors voided Tapp's immunity agreement on January 29, 1997, accusing him of being untruthful. The pressure on Tapp was mounting, and he was running out of options. To make matters worse, Tapp was taken to the crime scene on the same day, but his lawyer refused to accompany him. After the visit, Tapp changed his story once again. In this version, Tapp claimed that he had held Angie down while Benjamin and another man named Mike committed the murder. Nobody except Tapp seemed to know who this Mike was. The new revelation left the detective scrambling to piece together a coherent narrative. It wasn't until January 30th, 1997, during another lie detector test, that Tapp finally revealed his final version of what happened. He confessed to taking part in attacking Angie, but only because Benjamin had threatened to kill him. In a shocking turn of events, on February 3, 1997, Tapp was charged with first-degree murder and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. But what about Benjamin, the supposed ringleader of the crime? Despite being convicted of the unrelated Nevada crime, he was never charged in Angie's death. Meanwhile, Jeremy, who Tapp had previously accused of taking part in the crime, had been initially charged as an accessory. However, the charges were later dismissed, leaving Tapp to face the full brunt of the prosecution's case against him. The trial of Tapp began the following year in May 1998, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to witness the outcome of the highly publicized case. Tapp vehemently maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His lawyer also pointed out that the DNA test proved he wasn't the killer. In addition to this, the lawyer tried to have Tapp's confession thrown out, arguing that it was coerced, but the judge allowed it to be admitted as evidence. To further bolster their case, prosecutors brought in a surprise witness, a young woman named Destiny Osborne. She recounted being at a party a few days after Angie was killed and overheard Tapp and Benjamin talking about the crime. Carol, Angie's mother, was a constant presence throughout the trial. She sat in the front row listening intently to every piece of testimony. Her grief was palpable, and she was determined to see justice served. She hoped for the death penalty, believing that Tapp deserved to suffer for the pain he had inflicted on her daughter. As the trial came to a close, the jury's verdict was clear. Tapp was guilty. However, the judge decided to spare Tapp from the death penalty, instead sentencing him to 30 years to life in prison. Despite this outcome, Carol, the mother of the victim, remained inconsolable. She cleared a tab with disdain throughout the trial, and as the verdict was announced, she stormed out of the courtroom in frustration. She wasn't entirely satisfied with the outcome of the trial. Despite Tapp's conviction, Carol couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to the story. She refused to believe that Tapp acted alone and was determined to uncover the truth. She knew that the DNA found at the scene didn't match Tapp's, and this only fueled her desire to find the real killer. She knew the perpetrator responsible for her daughter's death was still out there. The authorities also shared the same sentiments. Due to this, they continued to search for other possible perpetrators who might match the DNA found at the scene. As the years passed, the investigation into Angie's murder seemed to have reached a dead end. However, Carol never lost hope that the person responsible for her daughter's death would be found. In 2009, over a decade after Angie was brutally killed, the unknown killer's DNA was finally entered into a national crime database. Despite this breakthrough, there was still no match. But then, Carol received an unexpected Christmas gift, a computer. Without hesitation, she put it to good use and discovered a company in Florida that could analyze DNA samples to identify the race of the donor. The police agreed to the test, and the results showed the unknown person was 85% Caucasian. This result helped detectives know what to focus on. Despite the long wait, Carol's persistence and determination continued to fuel her search for the truth. She was determined to get the best and brightest minds involved to help find the person responsible for Angie's death. After some searching, she stumbled upon Dr. Greg Hampikin, a leading forensic DNA expert who had founded the Idaho Innocence Project, an organization dedicated to correcting and preventing wrongful convictions. At the time Carol contacted Hampikin, he was already familiar with Angie's murder case. In fact, Tapp had previously written to the Idaho Innocence Project from prison, pleading with them to investigate his conviction. With Hampikin's guidance, Carol was able to push the Idaho Falls Police Department to try a novel approach called familial DNA testing. This involved looking at the database of convicted offenders in Idaho for anyone who might be related to Angie's killer. Although this method was not allowed in Idaho, Hampikin proposed an even bolder plan, uploading the crime scene sample to public databases. To Carol's relief, the police were willing to give this idea a shot. In the summer of 2014, detectives searched the public DNA database owned by Ancestry.com and finally got a hit. The DNA match was Michael Ursi Sr., whose Y-DNA closely matched the perpetrators on 34 out of 35 STR markers. Although it was not a definitive match, it was close enough to make detectives believe they had found a relative of Angie's killer. Detectives shifted their focus to investigating Michael Ursi Sr.'s family members, and his son, named Michael Ursi Jr., soon caught their attention. Could this be the same Mike that Tapp once mentioned during his interrogation back in 1997? The detectives delved deeper into the younger Ursi's background, and they discovered he was a filmmaker living in New Orleans. His work included a dark movie called Murderabilia, which dealt with the murder of a young woman. Due to Michael's macabre cinematic taste, the detectives began to suspect that he might have been involved in Angie's murder. In December 2014, over 18 years after Angie's murder, Michael was arrested. Detectives from Idaho Falls and a Louisiana State Police officer took Michael to a police office near the New Orleans Superdome and began interrogating him. During the interrogation, the detectives found out that Michael had friends in Idaho and had been in the area at the time of the murder. This was a crucial piece of information that raised suspicions. Following this, detectives then swabbed Michael's cheek for DNA and drove him home. Michael was now their prime suspect, but would the DNA match what was found at the crime scene? They did not have to wait too long for the answer because weeks later, it was discovered that his DNA did not match the crime scene sample. This news was a huge blow to the detectives working on the case. It seemed as if they were back to square one once again. However, they refused to give up on this new method of familial DNA testing that had brought them so close to the truth. They were more determined than ever to keep digging and uncover any lead, no matter how small it might seem. They knew that solving this case would bring long-awaited justice to Angie and her family, and they were not going to let it go cold again. While all this was going on, Carol was in a state of confusion. She wanted justice for her daughter, and despite her doubts about Tapp, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. In fact, a year before Michael Ursi's involvement in the case, she had immersed herself in 60 hours of interrogation footage from Tapp's case. From watching the footage, she uncovered a series of troubling inconsistencies in his story that left her with nagging doubts. Carol wasn't about to let Tapp remain behind bars if he truly was innocent. So she contacted Tapp's defense attorney, John Thomas, and shared her doubts about his guilt. Thomas was intrigued and wanted to help. He joined forces with Carol and enlisted the expertise of Stephen Drazen, a renowned expert of false confessions. As Drazen reviewed the interrogation tapes, he couldn't shake the feeling that Tapp had been manipulated into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. Then he uncovered a damning truth. Tapp had been coerced with the threat of the death penalty during his interrogation in 1997. The police had played a dangerous game, dangling Tapp's life in front of him to extract a confession. Drazen quickly got to work, compiling a report that detailed the coercive tactics used by the police. In his report, Drazen also concluded that there was no evidence that Tapp was at the crime scene or that he participated in the murder. Following this, Drazen contacted the Innocence Project of New York, recruiting them to work alongside the Idaho Innocence Project and Judges for Justice. Together, they launched a massive effort to secure Tapp's release from prison. The winds of change were blowing as Tapp's case gradually took an unprecedented turn. In 2015, the prosecutor's office hired an independent investigator to review Tapp's conviction. The investigator's findings shook the very foundation of Tapp's conviction. He discovered that the information Tapp had stated during his interrogation had been fed to him by law enforcement officials. Even the polygrapher's statement during the polygraph examinations were found to be coercive in nature. Despite this, the investigator believed that Tapp had been present during the attack and murder of Angie, but questioned Tapp's confession about being personally involved in the crime. May 2016 was a pivotal moment for Tapp as his attorneys filed a motion for post-conviction relief, claiming that his confession was coerced and deceptive. They hoped that new DNA evidence would clear his name, but the prosecutor wasn't willing to budge. Not until Carol, Tapp's lawyers, and the community came together in a powerful display of solidarity. They demanded justice for Tapp, and their voices grew too loud to ignore. Finally, County Prosecutor Daniel Clark made an offer. Tapp would be released from prison, but he would have to live with the convictions on his record and be placed on parole for at least a decade. It was a tempting offer, but Tapp refused. He was determined to clear his name and prove his innocence no matter the cost. After much deliberation, Tapp's defense attorney, John Thomas, was able to convince the prosecutor to agree to a new deal. This time, Tapp would be allowed to walk free after serving 20 years in prison. He would lose the abuse charge but would keep the murder charge. And if the real killer was ever found, Tapp would be exonerated. It was a tough decision, but Tapp accepted the deal. In a shocking turn of events, Destiny Osborne, the surprise witness who had once claimed to have heard Tapp confess to the murder, recanted her testimony, accusing the police of pressuring her to falsely implicate Tapp. Her admission added to the mounting evidence of coercion and deceit that surrounded Tapp's case and raised even more questions about the veracity of his conviction. Finally, on March 22, 2017, Tapp walked out of prison as a free man. But even with his newfound freedom, he still carried the weight of being a convicted murderer. Worst of all, the real killer of Angie was still at large, and this left the community on edge and desperate for answers. In the summer of 2017, the Idaho Falls Police Department underwent some major changes with the appointment of a new police chief, Bryce Johnson, and the refreshing of the Investigations Bureau. One of the officers selected to lead the bureau was Bill Squires, who had been a rookie cop at the time of Angie's murder and had assisted with the crime scene investigation. The bureau began putting in more effort to crack the case once and for all. Meanwhile, Carol heard about genetic genealogy and the groundbreaking work being done at Parabon Nanolabs. She was determined to explore this avenue for her daughter's case and contacted the chief genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore. However, the DNA evidence in Angie's case was severely degraded and Parabon initially turned down the request. But Carol was not one to give up easily, and she personally appealed to Moore to take on the case. Moved by Carol's persistence and dedication, Moore eventually agreed to help and begin working with the police on Angie's case in the fall of 2018. Despite this seemingly impossible task of deciphering the DNA evidence, Moore was not deterred. She began building family trees of people who shared DNA with the unknown suspect. Moore's investigation eventually led her to one marriage that dated back to the 1800s, and she soon established that the suspect had to be the grandson or great-grandson of a man called Clarence Usery. Through birth certificates and obituaries, she identified 6 men who were the right age to have committed the crime in 1996, with one of them living in Idaho. Moore handed the names over to the Idaho Falls Police Department, who then needed to obtain DNA samples of the 6 men. After days of tailing the suspects, the police were able to secretly acquire the samples. But to their dismay, none of the suspects matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Despite this setback, Moore refused to accept defeat and went back to the drawing board. She had examined the family tree she had constructed, trying to identify any potential cracks in the genealogical branches. She knew that the tree may be incomplete with missing branches due to marriages, divorces, and adoptions that were not documented. After days of painstaking research, she discovered a critical piece of information in an obituary that would lead to a breakthrough. The obituary revealed that a woman named Helen Darnell had a daughter named Linda Darnell, who was previously married to a member of the Ursi family named Philip. Following their divorce, Linda gave birth to a son named Brian Drips, who was raised with his stepfather's surname. And with this, Moore knew she had finally found the missing link to the family tree. When Moore shared Drips' name with the investigators on May 1, 2019, they were in disbelief. Not only did Drips live in Idaho Falls at the time of the murder, but he resided right across the street from Angie's house. The police had even contacted him during their initial investigations, but had not noticed anything suspicious about him. It was clear that they had missed a vital piece of the puzzle. As they delved deeper, they discovered that Tripp had left Idaho Falls just 7 weeks after the murder. The timing was too coincidental, and it seemed like he was trying to cover his tracks. In May 2019, detectives journeyed to Caldwell, Idaho to investigate Drips. They were eager to gather DNA evidence to confirm their suspicions. However, this task proved to be more challenging than they expected. In the first hour of watching him, Drips carelessly tossed a cigarette but out of his car window. An officer raced to retrieve it from the busy road, but it was lost among dozens of other cigarette butts. The police had to keep watching him for another 24 hours before they got another chance. Finally, on the afternoon of May 10, 2019, detectives witnessed Tripp throwing another cigarette but out of his car window. Once he had driven off, an undercover officer rushed into the busy road to retrieve it, while other officers blocked cars from injuring the detective. The cigarette butt was successfully recovered and immediately sent for testing. When the test results came back, the detectives were thrilled to learn that it was a match. Drips was the killer. The case had finally been solved, and justice for Angie Dodge was within reach. On May 15, 2019, the long-awaited breakthrough in the case occurred when 53-year-old Drips was arrested and charged with her murder. In a police interrogation, Drips was confronted with the DNA evidence and eventually admitted to the heinous crime. According to him, he had gone alone to Angie's apartment with the intention of taking advantage of her, but had not planned to kill her. He also claimed he didn't know Tapp, who was previously convicted of the crime. Finally, justice was served for Tapp as well when his murder conviction was nullified and he was exonerated on July 17, 2019. However, the trauma of spending years in prison for a crime he did not commit left him scarred, and he filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Idaho Falls and 7 former Idaho Falls Police Department officers in December of that year. On February 9, 2021, Drips pleaded guilty to the murder of Angie. The prosecution and defense came to an agreement that Drips would serve life in prison with the possibility of parole after at least 20 years. But both parties knew that due to his failing health, 20 years was essentially a life sentence for Drips. He would likely die in prison. On June 7, 2022, the sentence was handed down and Drips was officially condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. Before the verdict, Drips stood up at the defense table, his voice barely above a whisper, and apologized. He expressed his remorse for what he had done, saying, "I wish I could do over that night." It was a small comfort for those who had suffered so much in the wake of Angie's death. But the story didn't end there. In June 2022, officials announced that they had agreed to pay $11,700,000 to Tapp. The payout was a small consolation for the years he lost, but it was a step towards making things right. It was also a reminder that justice, although delayed, can still be served. And that's the conclusion of the tragic and complicated case of Angie Dodge's murder. From the initial arrest of Tapp to the eventual conviction of Drips, this case had been marked by twists and turns, wrongful accusations, and long overdue justice. It's a case that has left a lasting impact on the community of Idaho Falls and the broader public, highlighting both the importance and fallibility of DNA evidence in criminal investigations. As we reflect on this case, we are left with a question: how can we continue to improve our justice system to ensure that the guilty are held accountable while also preventing wrongful convictions that can cause so much harm? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. In contrast to the serene town of Laurel, Miranda Cowan Fenner's birthplace, Sacramento, was a vibrant city in California. Born on December 26, 1979, to Mike and Sherry Fenner, Miranda had a younger brother named Tim. When Miranda was only 11 years old, her family relocated to Laurel, Montana. Despite leaving her childhood friends and familiar environment behind, Miranda adjusted swiftly and soon made new friends in her new home. She attended Laurel High School, where she excelled both academically and socially. But it wasn't just books and academics that kept her busy. She also had a creative side that she nurtured by spending time with her loved ones, drawing and exploring the latest trends in fashion. Whether it was indulging in a shopping spree with her gal pals or sketching her latest design, Miranda always found joy in the little things in life. After years of hard work, Miranda finally graduated from Laurel High School in May 1998, proud of all she had accomplished. Fresh out of high school, Miranda was ready to take on the world. It wasn't long before an opportunity presented itself in the form of a job at the movie store, a charming video rental store located at 419 Main Street in Laurel. Miranda loved her job and quickly became a familiar face to the store's regulars. With her infectious smile, she greeted every customer with enthusiasm and a willingness to help. The store was only a stone's throw away from her family home, and Miranda often walked to and from work, taking in the sights and sounds of her beloved town. Miranda was content with her life, but fate can be cruel and tragedy soon struck like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. On Sunday, November 15, 1998, just a few minutes past 8 p.m., the Laurel Police Department received a frantic call reporting a shooting at the movie store where 18-year-old Miranda worked. The caller, who had been driving by, noticed a woman desperately trying to crawl out of the doorway of the video store and immediately pull over to help. He said that as he approached, he realized with horror that the woman seemed to have been shot in the neck and was fighting for her life. Police officers rushed to the scene, their sirens wailing as they sped through the quiet streets. When they arrived on the scene, they were met with a shocking sight. 3 people huddled around a woman who lay in a pool of blood directly to the right of the front door of the video rental store. The officers immediately rushed to her aid, but it was clear that she was in bad shape. Her body was drenched in blood, making it difficult for them to determine where the injuries were. She was unconscious and unresponsive with only a weak pulse to indicate that she was still alive. The officers knew they had to act quickly to save her life. As they worked to stabilize her, they noticed the deep slashing injuries to her neck and their hearts sank. They wondered if a shooting had taken place or if something even more sinister was at play. The officers called for medical personnel to respond to the area, and they continued to do everything in their power to keep the victim alive. It was a race against time. The evening air was thick with tension and fear as an ambulance pulled up to the scene of the shooting. The officers worked quickly as they helped to move the badly injured victim into the ambulance. The ambulance then raced through the streets, its sirens blaring as it rushed towards a nearby location where a helicopter was waiting to take the victim to St. Vincent Hospital in Billings. As they arrived at the hospital, the victim was whisked away to an operating room, where a team of skilled surgeons worked tirelessly. The hospital was filled with a sense of urgency, and everyone worked together with a singular purpose: to save the victim's life. It didn't take long for the victim to be identified as none other than Miranda. Meanwhile, back at the movie store, a flurry of activity was going on. Police officers had made their way in through the back door of the store, which they noticed was slightly open. Inside, chaos reigned supreme. The store was in complete disarray. But that wasn't the worst part. There was a trail of blood leading from the back of the store to the front door where Miranda had evidently crawled in agony. The officers were shocked by all they saw. After securing the scene of the crime, they quickly notified the command staff and detectives from both the Laurel Police Department and the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office. When detectives arrived, they quickly got to work. They took measurements and sketches of the outside of the store before swiftly moving inside. The scene was gruesome, and the detectives couldn't help but feel a twinge of horror as they checked for fingerprints and footprints. The flash of cameras filled the room as they photographed the scene, capturing every last detail. In their pursuit of justice, they seized several physical items that could help bring the perpetrator to justice. As they worked, patrol officers also scoured the surrounding area, knocking on doors and talking to locals, hoping to gather more information and identify witnesses. One of the officers, simply identified as Officer Wells, was soon dispatched from the crime scene to St. Vincent Hospital to check on the condition of Miranda and to secure any valuable evidence that might help in the investigation. Upon arriving, he was quickly escorted to the operating room, where he donned a sterile gown and entered the operating room. There, he witnessed the surgeon's valiant efforts to save Miranda's life. But sadly, at 10:01 p.m., she was declared dead. Her injuries were just too severe. It was a heartbreaking moment for everyone. The news of Miranda's death spread like wildfire and soon reached her family's ears. The weight of the tragedy hit them like a ton of bricks, leaving them devastated and struggling to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. The following day, November 16, 1998, an autopsy was conducted on Miranda's body by Dr. Tom Bennett, who was assisted by Dr. Ken Mueller. As they examined her, they discovered the brutal truth. Miranda had been stabbed and slashed in the throat, leaving her with no chance of survival. The only other wound they found was a defensive laceration on her right index finger. With Abby Hartz, they classified her death as a homicide. In the wake of Miranda's tragic death, detectives and law enforcement officers began an intense investigation to catch the killer. They left no stone unturned, interviewing hundreds of people and combing through every possible lead. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to locate a suspect or identify a clear motive for the crime. It was noted that a small amount of cash had been taken from the video store's register, so the detectives could not entirely rule out the possibility that robbery was a motive. The days that followed were filled with frustration and despair as the investigation seemed to hit one dead end after another. Despite months passing by, the case remained open and active, and detectives continued to work tirelessly to uncover any leads. Meanwhile, Miranda's family refused to give up hope, and they took matters into their own hands. They printed posters with Miranda's picture and the haunting words, "Murdered in Montana," and plastered them across the country. Their determination to find justice for Miranda never wavered, even in the face of uncertainty and grief. It was a hot July day in 2000, just 2 years after the brutal murder of Miranda, when Dawson County Sheriff's deputies received a tip about a man they wanted to question in connection with a traffic-related incident. The officers spotted the man whose identity they did not reveal in the city of Glendive, Montana, and attempted to stop him. But before they could even approach him, the man pulled out a gun and shot one of the deputies in the leg. In an instant, the peaceful town turned into a chaotic scene as officers scrambled for cover and returned fire. The exchange ended with the man losing his life. The news of the man's death soon sparked a new wave of rumors and speculation about Miranda's unsolved murder. It was said that he had made some shocking claims before his death. Claims that he was involved in the brutal killing of Miranda in 1998. These rumors were enough to catch the attention of the then Yellowstone County Sheriff, Chuck Maxwell. He was determined to leave no stone unturned in his quest to bring Miranda's killer to justice. He dispatched 2 of his best detectives to Glendive to investigate any possible links between the man who was shot and killed and the death of Miranda. After an extensive investigation, the detectives reported that the rumors were unfounded and unconfirmed. The search for Miranda's killer continued. Years passed after this, and the murder remained unsolved. In February 2006, the case was thrust into the limelight, this time on a national TV talk show called The Montel Williams Show. Sherry, Miranda's heartbroken mother, appeared on the show with psychic Sylvia Brown, who claimed to have some insight about the case. During the show, Sylvia revealed that she believed the killers were customers at the video store and had been loitering there. The psychic also shared that 2 men, aged 19 and 24, were responsible for Miranda's death and that they lived within a 5-mile radius of the store. Despite her emotional turmoil and skepticism of the psychic Sylvia, Sherry believed that being on the show was vital to bring Miranda's case to the attention of a larger audience. In the end, it wasn't about her doubts or fears, but about honoring her daughter's memory and finding justice for her senseless death. The Montel Williams Show proved to be a turning point in Miranda's case. After the show aired, Sherry began receiving a flood of phone calls and letters from people who had watched the program. Sherry was overwhelmed with hope and made it her mission to pass all the information she received to the detectives working on Miranda's case. However, despite the seemingly positive leads, detectives were unable to uncover any concrete evidence that would lead them to Miranda's killer. Years went by, but Sherry never lost hope. She continued to receive tips and leads about the brutal murder of her daughter Miranda. Every time she received new information, it was like opening up old wounds. But she knew that even the tiniest lead could be the key to finally finding her daughter's killer. In 2012, with an unwavering determination, Sherry printed new reward posters with Miranda's photo and the headline, "Justice for Miranda," in bold letters. The posters offered a $25,000 reward and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The posters were distributed not only in their state but also across the country as Sherry refused to rest until justice was served. It was a glimmer of hope for Miranda's family when the Billings Police Department's cold case unit was established in March of 2012. Finally, there was a dedicated team of detectives to work on unsolved murders. Miranda's murder case was transferred to the unit, and they didn't waste any time in redoubling their efforts to solve the case. 2 detectives, Frank Fritz and Shane Bancroft, took charge of the investigation, poring over old leads and finding new ones. Other detectives who were part of the cold case unit and working on Miranda's murder were confident that justice would finally be served. They knew that people in the community had information that could break the case wide open. With new technological advances in DNA testing and a constant stream of tips and leads, they were convinced that the killer's days were numbered. In October 2013, a woman named Beverly Saylor contacted authorities claiming that she had valuable information regarding the homicide of Miranda Fenner. Detective Bancroft was assigned to speak with her over the phone, and what she revealed left him stunned. Beverly was previously married to a man named David Saylor, who had children from a previous marriage. At the time of Miranda's murder, they were living in Laurel. Beverly said that she believed David's stepson, Zachary O'Neill, was involved in the crime and described him as a violent person. She recounted specific incidents that deeply troubled her and painted a disturbing picture of Zachary's personality. According to Beverly, her husband mentioned on several occasions over the years that Zachary had rented a movie on the night of the homicide. She left Montana shortly after the murder, but was now returning, which brought up memories and motivated her to call the authorities. Detective Bancroft was grateful for the information, but knew they had to investigate further to see if there was any truth to Beverly's claims. As he dug deeper, he found that while Zachary did live in the area at the time of the homicide, there was no other evidence linking him to the crime. It was yet another frustrating dead end for the detectives. As the years passed, various people even stepped forward to confess to the murder of Miranda. But each claim turned out to be a false lead, causing the detectives to end up chasing false confessions. The case seemed to be stuck in a never-ending loop of dashed hopes and futile attempts at closure. In a surprising twist of events, in April 2016, Zachary, the stepson who had been implicated by his former stepmother, made a shocking confession while at a psychiatric hospital in Spokane, Washington. He claimed to be responsible for the murder of Miranda. However, detectives were skeptical of his confession and considered him non-credible since the details he provided were already widely known. In addition, Zachary had also taken responsibility for a second murder that had not occurred, and this even further cast doubt on his credibility. As a result, detectives were forced to redirect their focus elsewhere in their pursuit of justice for Miranda. Almost a year later, on March 19, 2017, none other than Zachary walked into the Yellowstone County Detention Facility and asked to speak to deputies. As he was led into the interview room, the deputies couldn't help but notice that he didn't seem well. He appeared to be high on something, and they wondered what was going on with him. It was déjà vu as Zachary repeated the same story he had told almost a year earlier. He had murdered Miranda at the movie store in Laurel. He explained that he had been in and out of jails and prisons over the past several years, and that he had tried telling medical staff in Spokane about what he had done, but they did not take him seriously. He then went on to reveal that he had used methamphetamine, which explained his current state. After Zachary's confession, the deputies wasted no time in informing Detective Fritz of his revelation. The detective was determined to get to the bottom of the case, so he promised to contact Zachary the next day. Concerned about Zachary's well-being, one of the deputies offered to give him a ride to a crisis center. As they drove, the deputy urged Zachary to keep his phone charged and ready for a call from the detectives. Zachary nodded in agreement. 2 days later, on March 21, 2017, Zachary went to the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office to meet with Detectives Fritz and Bancroft. As they escorted him to a conference room, Zachary's face was stained with tears. Detectives inquired about the cause of his distress, and Zachary revealed that he had seen the Miranda reward posters in the lobby, which had triggered a wave of emotions within him. As Zachary sat in front of the detectives, he was visibly nervous and fidgety. Detective Bancroft noticed Zachary's unease and tried to make him feel at ease by letting him know that he wasn't there to arrest him. They read him his rights, and Zachary acknowledged that he understood. The detectives made it clear that they would need time to verify the truthfulness of whatever he was going to tell them before taking any action. Zachary then hesitated and revealed his desire to inform his parents before going public with the information. The detectives nodded, reassuring him there was no need to rush and that they would give him time to speak to his parents. As Zachary began his confession, he took the detectives back in time to his teenage years. He recounted that he had been living in Spokane, but had returned to Laurel around May of 1988 at the young age of 18. He claimed he lived with his stepfather David Saylor at 702 West 12th Street. Zachary admitted to spiraling down into the depth of drug addiction, committing thefts and burglaries to fund his habits. He soon began to talk about the day of the homicide. He revealed that he had been at home with his mother on that fateful day when she asked him to rent some movies. Due to this, he drove to the movie store and rented 4 or 5 movies, including an adult film. He described the car he drove at the time and said he paid cash for the rentals. The detectives confirmed that the account linked to Zachary's stepdad, David, was used to rent 4 movies at 5 o'clock and 4 seconds p.m. on the evening of the homicide. As Zachary spoke, he recalled vivid details about that fateful day. Miranda, wearing a blue shirt and glasses, had done nothing to provoke him when he rented the movies. But when he returned home, his mother was enraged upon discovering the adult film he rented and had ordered him to take it back. He took the film back to the movie store, and that was when he decided to rob it. He waited until other customers left, then pulled out a small .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol and demanded money from Miranda. She complied, and he took the cash without harming her. But then his paranoia kicked in, and he took Miranda to a back room, where he described in detail how he tied her up with tape so that he could make his escape. However, the thought of her being a witness still bothered him, so he reached for his knife and slit her throat. As Zachary recounted this gruesome scene to the detectives, he broke down into tears. He recounted that he had then panicked when he thought he had heard someone coming and fled out the back door, leaving Miranda behind, mortally wounded. Detectives leaned in, their eyes fixed on Zachary as he described the chilling details of how he supposedly took Miranda's life. But their questioning wasn't over yet. They needed to know if this was the first time he had hurt someone. The answer was far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. Zachary's voice quivered as he confessed to a brutal misconduct and attempted murder that had occurred just 1 month before Miranda's murder. The victim? A woman he had seen on Broadwater, someone he decided to prey on. With a coldness that sent shivers down the detective's spines, Zachary recounted how he had cut her throat and left her for dead. But then a shocking revelation: he had worn a condom during the attack and believed he had left it behind when he fled the scene. The detectives listened in horror as Zachary explained that he thought the victim had survived because her death hadn't been reported in the news. But why had he tried to kill her in the first place? Zachary's answer was simple: he was afraid of going to prison. As the interview progressed, detectives asked Zachary what had driven him to come forward after all these years. He spoke of the guilt and remorse that had plagued him ever since his stepbrother perished in a fire back in 2013. Zachary revealed that he had been struggling with depression and had considered taking his own life, and that he felt it was finally time to own up to his crimes. The detectives were no doubt stunned by the level of detail and consistency in his account. But despite this, they remained skeptical, and this led them to ask him why they should believe him. To this, Zachary confidently responded that he knew specific details that were never released to the public. The detectives couldn't believe Zachary just yet, because they knew that a confession alone was not enough to prove guilt under Montana law. They needed more concrete evidence to ensure justice was served. As the interrogation came to a close, the detectives made one last move to ensure that they had all the evidence they needed to solve the case. With Zachary's permission, they obtained buccal swabs from him to collect a DNA sample. The swabs were carefully packaged and sent to the Montana Forensic Division for analysis, where they hoped that the results would be the final piece of the puzzle that would bring justice to Miranda. After their interview with Zachary, Detective Fritz and Bancroft worked to corroborate his confession. They began by investigating the other case Zachary mentioned. Their research led them to an unsolved cold case with the Billings Police Department, which they immediately shared with Detective Kruger. As they compared notes, Detective Kruger became convinced that Zachary's admissions lined up with the brutal abuse of a newspaper carrier named Julia Lilithan on September 5, 1998. With this in mind, Detective Kruger took the DNA evidence from the case and compared it to the buccal swab obtained from Zachary. And on April 18, 2017, the Montana Forensic Division reported the astonishing news. The DNA profile from a condom found at the scene of the crime matched Zachary's. The evidence was undeniable, and Zachary's long-hidden crimes were finally coming to light. Detectives Fritz and Bancroft did not stop there. Their investigation led them to a friend of Zachary's, simply identified as SB. During an interview with detectives in May 2017, SB revealed that he had known Zachary since he was a young boy and that Zachary had a history of violent tendencies. SB recounted specific instances of Zachary's violent behavior and also disclosed that Zachary had confessed to him about killing Miranda 2 months before he confessed to the detectives. SB was devastated by Zachary's confession, especially because he knew Miranda and her family. SB went on to tell detectives about Zachary's stepbrother, who had died in a fire in 2013. Zachary had been seeking justice for his stepbrother's death, and when the people involved were convicted, he thought justice had been served. SB said he told Zachary that Miranda's family also deserved to have justice done, and he said he encouraged Zachary to turn himself in. SB claimed he drove Zachary to the sheriff's office for his interview with detectives in March of 2017. The detectives were amazed by Esp's stories, and it gave them another piece of evidence to add to the puzzle. That same May of 2017, detectives Fritz and Bancroft made their way to Spokane, Washington for another round of questioning with Zachary. As soon as Zachary started talking, the detectives realized they had not heard everything yet. This time, Zachary confessed to violating a third woman. He didn't shy away from the details as he recounted how he found her and took her to Riverfront Park where he took advantage of her. The detectives were horrified, but they pressed on with their questioning. Zachary maintained that he had not killed or hurt the woman beyond the violation. The detectives listened closely, knowing that every piece of information that he gave them could potentially help them bring justice to his victims. In early 2019, Detective Fritz was determined to find any case that could be connected to Zachary's heinous crimes. With Autumn Fry's help, they searched through records of defilement cases reported in 1998, and there it was, a case that occurred in Riverfront Park on September 12, 1998, just a week after the abuse of Julia, the newspaper carrier. As Detective Fritz dug deeper, he found eerie similarities between the victim's reports and Zachary's account of the events. The victim had been examined at a hospital and DNA evidence was recovered. Detective Fritz decided to test this DNA evidence against the sample collected from Zachary, and the results were undeniable. It was a match. This only further corroborated Zachary's story. Sadly, the victim in this case had passed away in 2013. But Detective Fritz was more determined than ever to bring justice to all those who were victimized by Zachary. After discovering all of the compelling evidence against Zachary, the detectives knew it was finally time to take action. Now, following their interview with Zachary in Spokane, Washington back in May 2017, he had gotten into trouble and was already serving a prison sentence for burglary and possession of firearms since December 2017, with a release date set for 2024. However, Zachary was eventually transferred from Washington to Montana to face charges for the brutal murder of Miranda and the abuse and attempted murder of the newspaper carrier in September 1998. Prosecutors decided not to charge him with the third crime, possibly because the victim had already passed away. On July 23, 2019, a hearing was held in a Montana courtroom where Zachary was formally charged with both crimes. Without hesitation, he pleaded guilty. Sentencing for both crimes was set for the following month, August, and Zachary agreed to remain in Montana until then. The day of reckoning finally arrived, August 23, 2019. Emotions ran high inside the district courtroom where Zachary was to be sentenced. He was brought in shackled in chains and handcuffs. As people settled in their seats, District Court Judge Jessica Fair made an announcement warning everyone that any outburst would not be tolerated. She singled out Zachary, reminding him that officers were present in the courtroom. The tension in the room was palpable and everyone held their breath, waiting for what was to come. The courtroom listened intently as Detective Bancroft testified, recounting how Zachary became a suspect in the case years after being overlooked. Then the air grew still as Julia, Zachary's victim from the September 5, 1998 attack, bravely took the stand. She shared the harrowing details of that fateful day, describing it as the worst of her life and the day she came face to face with pure evil. As Julia recounted how Zachary abused her and stabbed her repeatedly in the jaw, throat, hands, and arms, the room was filled with sniffles and tears. She described how she tried to reason with her attacker, telling him she was a single mother with cancer, but to no avail. The attack left her permanently injured with limited mobility and a lifetime of pain. But the trauma didn't end there, so Julia was left to grapple with depression, anxiety in the aftermath of the attack. It was a powerful testimony that left many in the courtroom moved and saw prosecutors asking for the stiffest of penalties for Zachary. Tension filled the courtroom as Miranda's parents took the stand. The pain of their loss was still fresh and raw, and the sight of Zachary sitting in chairs before them only added fuel to their emotions. When Sherry, Miranda's mother, began to speak, her voice quivered with barely contained rage. She glared at Zachary and called him a vicious monster, spitting out the words with venom. She went on to say that she could not find any forgiveness in her soul for the despicable acts he had committed against her daughter. Her words echoed through the courtroom, leaving no doubt that Zachary's actions had forever shattered the lives of everyone he had hurt. When Zachary's defense attorney, Chris Copenhaver, took the stand, she painted a different picture of her client. She revealed how Zachary's addiction to meth began at the tender age of 10 and grew stronger as the years went by. However, Copenhaver told the court that Zachary had undergone a transformation since confessing his crimes to law enforcement. She believed he had the capacity for change and that he deserved a second chance. In a last-ditch effort to humanize Zachary, his biological father, Mark O'Neill, and his sister took the stand to offer their support. They expressed their heartfelt apologies to Miranda's family and expressed their hope for them to move forward despite the heart-wrenching ordeal they had gone through. It was soon time for the sentencing, and the courtroom held its collective breath as all eyes turned to Judge Jessica as she delivered Zachary's fate. The tension was palpable and the silence was deafening as the judge declared the sentence that Zachary would be forced to serve. She handed him not one, not two, but 3 life sentences for the atrocities he had committed against Miranda and Julia. But that wasn't all. Zachary was also designated as a level 3 high-risk violent offender, which means that he would be closely monitored for the rest of his life. The severity of his crimes demanded that he be kept off the streets, and the judge made it clear that he would not be eligible for parole until he had served a minimum of 30 years behind bars. The weight of the sentence hung heavy in the courtroom as Zachary was led away, knowing that he would spend the rest of his days paying for the horrors he had inflicted upon his victims. And with that, the case of Miranda Fenner came to a close. A man who had evaded justice for so long was finally held accountable for his heinous crimes. Although justice was served, the scars of his actions will forever remain with the victims and their families. But if Zachary had not confessed to the crimes, do you think the case would have ever been solved? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. In CSI, Las Vegas Season 2, Episode 21, titled Anatomy of a Lie, Grissom and Sarah investigate the case of a man found in a shallow grave in a park, covered in lye. They discover that the man had been struck by a car, survived the impact, but gradually bled out approximately 72 hours after the collision. The investigation leads them to a young lawyer who, while driving under the influence, accidentally hit the man. The victim became lodged in the lawyer's windshield, and after going home and hitting the man in his garage as he sobered up, the lawyer realized the man was still alive. Fearing the impact on his career, the lawyer allowed the man to bleed to death before disposing of the body. Watching these old episodes back is great. This episode actually features a young Zachary Quinto in one of his first on-screen roles. This episode was based on the real-life murder of Gregory Biggs on October 26, 2001 in Fort Worth, Texas around 3 a.m. 25-year-old Shantae Joanne Mallard was driving home from a nightclub. Mallard should not have been behind the wheel. At the party, she had been drinking heavily and partaking in both cannabis and ecstasy. Mallard was less than a mile away from home when she hit a man with her car. The collision was at such a high velocity that the man became embedded in her windshield. She stopped briefly and attempted to dislodge the man from her car. She knew at the time he was still alive. Shantae was a trained nurse's aide, however. She also knew she was in no position to be behind the wheel, and she was at fault for the collision. Her self-preservation overtook this stranger's life. The man was Gregory Biggs, a 37-year-old man walking alongside the highway before he'd been struck. A series of unfortunate events had led to Gregory becoming homeless. Gregory had gotten into a new relationship, and his new girlfriend had fallen on tough times. Gregory loaned her money to help her out. This led to him not making his truck payments, and his truck was required for him to do his work as a self-employed bricklayer. Gregory had his vehicle repossessed, and he lost his house when he was unable to work, making it so he also couldn't afford his medications. Gregory had schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and relied on his medication to help him live a balanced life. He'd started new work as a bus driver and had been attempting to piece his life back together, but his mental health had made it a challenge for him to keep up with every teen. Shame and embarrassment for his situation led to Gregory losing touch with those closest to him. His son said that he lost touch with his father sometime around July 2001 back on the highway. Shantae gave up trying to get Gregory off of her car. When she finally gave up, she drove her Chevrolet Cavalier home with Gregory still lodged in her windshield. She parked her car in her garage and left Gregory bleeding heavily, conscious and begging for help over the next several hours. Shantae continually checked in on Gregory to see if he had finally bled out. She said that she apologized to him, but never made any attempt to help him. After many hours, Gregory finally lost consciousness and eventually bled out the next day. Chaunt enlisted her ex-boyfriend, Cleet Denell Jackson, to help dispose of the body. Mallard, Jackson, and another man waited until it was dark. Then they took Gregory to a nearby park and dumped him there. They then attempted to destroy evidence from the crash by setting fire to the vehicle. On October 27th, Gregory's body was discovered in Cobb Park. An investigation into his murder began, but there was little evidence and little hope that the case would be solved. Hit and runs are very challenging cases. For months later, police got a call from a woman who said that she might have information regarding a hit and run victim. Miranda Danielle said that she'd been at a party when an acquaintance, Shantae Mallard, had made some concerning statements to her. Danielle noted that Mallard had said, "I hit this white man," and had been laughing about the situation. It was a strong enough lead, and police decided to bring Mallard in for questioning. A search warrant was also issued to search Mallard's home for evidence. They located Mallard's car in the garage, which had significant damage to the hood and the front bumper. Additionally, it was also missing the windshield entirely, and they found the seats to the vehicle in the backyard that had extensive burn damage. Officers discovered a dried pool of blood soaked in the concrete floor of the garage. There was also significant blood evidence on the inside and outside of the vehicle. There was a lot of blood evidence in the garage, far more than anything other than homicide could explain. On February 26, 2002, Shantae Mallard was arrested and charged initially with failing to stop and render aid. She was released on bond the same day. However, once officers got a report back from Gregory's autopsy, Mallard was arrested again on a murder charge as well as tampering with evidence. The two men that helped Mallard were also arrested and charged with tampering with evidence. They both plead guilty and received 10 years and agreed to testify against Mallard. Mallard pled guilty to tampering with evidence, but pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. Her trial began in June of 2003. Mallard apologized to the court, as well as directly to the Biggs family. She said that she had panicked and was afraid of getting arrested. Several experts testified that Gregory would have survived his injuries, but Mallard had shown a remarkable disregard for human life by concealing him until he bled out, a process that would have left him suffering for many hours. The jury took less than an hour to deliberate. Mallard was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murder charge and 10 years for tampering with evidence. Shantae Mallard remains incarcerated, and she will be eligible for parole in 2027. In Season 3, Episode 17 of CSI Vegas, we follow a case where a woman drives into a cafe. In the episode, she had multiple fatalities and several injured victims. The team worked to determine if the crash was an accident or intentional. In the show, the woman had died in the crash. This was a deviation from the actual case this episode was based on. It was based on an incident on Thanksgiving Day in 1980, when Priscilla Joyce Ford drove her car into a lineup of people waiting to get into a casino in Rio, Nevada. Ford had been drunk and had intentionally driven into the crowd at 40 miles per hour, resulting in her killing 6 and injuring 23 people. Officers quickly arrested her at the scene and said that she very calmly went into custody, only asking officers how many were dead. Ford explained that she was following the voices in her head. She had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia 10 years prior, which had ended her career as a teacher. She had a hard time sticking to a treatment plan for her mental illness and had sought treatment at 7 different hospitals, but continued to be released without any follow-up. Ford had a 6-month-long trial, where the main conversation was determining whether Ford was fit to stand trial. The judge had ordered a mental health treatment plan and followed a mental health evaluation. He found that she was well enough to continue with the trial. Ford pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, however. On March 12, 1982, after a 13-hour deliberation by the jury, Ford was found guilty of all 6 counts of murder and 23 counts of attempted murder. Ford was sentenced to death by gas chamber. Ford's lawyers had attempted several appeals, which were all denied. The legal proceedings delayed the sentence from being carried out for over 2 decades. Ford died in 2005 at the age of 75 in the Southern Nevada Women's Correctional Center of Emphysema. In Season 6, Episode 3 of CSI, dubbed Bite Me, it covers the story of a man whose wife fell down the stairs and died. The investigation called into question the validity of the husband's timeline and the circumstances of the evidence. This episode follows the real-life case involving the death of Kathleen Peterson that died on December 9th, 2001. When I started researching this case, I realized I had heard about it before. I had watched The Staircase on Netflix a few years ago, which, to be honest, was one of the worst true crime docs I have ever watched, and I would not recommend. In Michael Peterson's retelling of the events that had occurred, he said that he and his wife, Kathleen, had been having a drink together at their pool. It was a rare night when all of the kids were out of the house. He said that they had dinner, watched a movie, and decided to continue chatting outside, as they often did. He said that they stayed up and chatted for a while, and then Kathleen said goodnight and went in for the night. But he said that he decided to stay in a little bit longer. He said that he had fallen asleep and woke up around 2:40 a.m. And when Michael went back inside, he found Kathleen at the foot of the stairs with blood everywhere. He called 911. Michael claimed that Kathleen had fallen down the stairs, but nothing about the evidence supported a fall down the stairs. There was blood everywhere in a variety of spray patterns. Kathleen also had blood on the bottom of her feet, indicating that she had been standing at some point. Blood was also found all around the house, including blood on the front porch. Who were the Petersons? Kathleen was 48 and was a successful executive at Nortel Networks. She was an intelligent, strong, hardworking, and vivacious woman. Kathleen was involved in her community, serving on several boards for the arts. She was a super mom to her daughter Caitlin from her first marriage, as well as Michael's sons and the two girls that they adopted together. Their home was described as always filled with love, laughter, and trust. Kathleen seemed to excel at everything she did, from work, being a mother, and a wife. She had met Michael in 1986. Michael had just recently separated from his wife, Patty, and was in the process of relocating back to the United States after spending several years in Germany. Michael had served in the Vietnam War, but after a car accident had left him with a permanent disability, he was discharged from the military. While Michael and his first wife had been living in Germany, they befriended another couple, Elizabeth and George Ratliff. Elizabeth worked with Patty, and George was a captain in the Air Force serving in the Vietnam War. George had died on duty, and 2 years after, in 1985, Patty died as well. Her cause of death had been deemed by both German officials and the U.S. military police as an intracerebral hemorrhage caused by a pre-existing blood clotting disorder. In both George and Elizabeth's wills, they had listed Michael and Patty as the caretakers for their two daughters, Martha and Margaret. Less than a year after, Michael and Patty separated. Patty maintained custody of their two sons, Clayton and Todd, in Germany, and Michael took the Ratliff girls back to the U.S. with him. Kathleen and Michael merged their families a few years later, and they officially adopted Margaret and Martha together. Eventually, Clayton and Todd joined the family, and all the children lived in Durham, North Carolina. When Michael had moved back to the States, he began his career as a fiction novelist. He had a successful career writing several popular war-themed novels. However, he seemed to have played up his military career. He'd made a habit of implying that the injuries that resulted in him being discharged had occurred during active duty, when they had actually happened in Japan while he was on leave. He also claimed to have several war medals. He said that he'd received a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Valor, and 2 Purple Hearts for his heroic efforts in the war. His military records showed that he had received a Silver Star and a Bronze Star. Although not precisely criminal behavior, it showed the actions he was willing to go to paint a narrative that fit with the story he wanted to tell. After Kathleen's death, Michael would go on to tell numerous people how drunk Kathleen had been that night. He said that they had consumed 2 bottles of wine that evening, and Kathleen had also taken a Valium pill for her insomnia. While her autopsy revealed that she had consumed alcohol that night, she hadn't even been over the legal limit to drive, indicating she likely only had a glass or 2 that evening, not a whole bottle. Her autopsy also showed several severe injuries that were inconsistent with a fall down the stairs. She had several lacerations to the top and back of her head that appeared to be from blunt force trauma, according to the medical examiner. She also had a fracture in her thyroid neck cartilage, as well as a significant amount of bruising. And based on her injuries, They estimated that she had died from the blood loss of her head injuries over a period of 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Medical examiner deemed her death a homicide, and a week later, Michael Peterson was arrested and charged with the death of his wife. The defense team alleged that the evidence painted a different scene than Michael had depicted based on the blood evidence. They alleged that Michael had brutally beaten Kathleen and left her thinking she was dead. But at some point, she regained consciousness, which explained the blood on the bottom of her feet. They alleged that Michael discovered Kathleen was conscious and walking, and he beat her again, leaving her to bleed out while he cleaned up the scene. Michael was barefoot when officers had arrived at the scene. His shoes and socks were covered in blood near Kathleen. A shoe print matching Michael's shoe was found on Kathleen's pants at the back of her knee, which investigators found odd because Kathleen was found face up. So there was no explanation for a perfect shoe print on the back of her pants. Michael also had blood splatter on the inside of the leg of his shorts but nowhere else, which seemed odd. Michael's lawyer David Rudolph argued, "What our experts tell us happened is that at some point Kathleen fell backwards and hit her head. She lay bleeding, gets up, steps into a pool of blood, slips, hits her head again, and she bled out." In addition to the blood evidence, it was discovered that the couple had over $143,000 in credit card debt. The house was also a financial burden. The 14-bedroom mansion required immense upkeep. It needed a new roof, plumbing work, and they suspected a termite infestation in their living room. Kathleen had told her sister that she wanted to sell the home and downsize, but Mike didn't have any interest in moving. Kathleen's company Nortel was also experiencing financial issues that resulted in 45,000 employees being laid off. And Kathleen had suspected her job security was at risk as well. She had a $1,400,000 life insurance policy through her employer, which she would lose if she were laid off, which indeed would have pointed to a motive for murder. Lastly, the piece of evidence that came to light cast significant doubt into the picture of a perfect marriage, painted by Michael. On his computer and in his emails were lengthy conversations that Michael had with an escort. It came to light that Michael was forced to address that he was bisexual and had been with men during his marriage to Kathleen, which he claimed she knew about and accepted. Michael Peterson's trial started in 2003. His trial lasted 3 months, and he was ultimately found guilty, but years later, it had been determined that there had been several issues during his original trial. A blood expert, Dwayne Deaver, testified on behalf of the prosecutor, outlining the blood stain pattern analysis. He told the jury that he was a highly trained expert, testifying that he had participated in over 500 crime scene cases and was highly regarded as one of the leading experts in his field. It was believed that Deaver's testimony was what convinced the jury to find Michael Peterson guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In 2010, it was found that Dwayne Deaver, who worked for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, had on numerous occasions misrepresented or withheld evidence to the court, as well as grossly falsifying, disqualifying his qualifications, and had far less experience than he led jurors to believe. This included evidence submitted to the courts in Michael Peterson's trial. It was found that several pieces of favorable evidence had been held from the defense, which had made the entire trial unfair. In 2011, Peterson was granted a new trial and released on bond while he waited another trial. A new trial allowed his legal team to look at plea deals. In 2017, Michael Peterson accepted an Alford plea, where he made no admission of guilt, but acknowledged that there was enough evidence against him to convict. Peterson was 74 at the time and had already served 8 years in prison. He was sentenced to 86 months in jail, and because he had already served 98 months, it was considered time served and he was released. To this day, there are still no definitive answers about what happened to Kathleen, and we will likely never know. On September 2, 1999, Ronald Cohen and his family were moving out of their home at 67 Forest Drive in Jericho, Long Island, and addressing some final tasks for the new owner. One of these tasks was to remove a 55-gallon oil barrel that had been stored in a crawl space beneath an addition to the house. The barrel had been there since Cohen moved in. After removing it from the basement, Cohen arranged for it to be picked up by sanitation workers, but they left it behind with a note saying the 345-pound drum was too heavy for them to handle. Cohen decided to open the barrel to sort its contents for disposal and was met with a horrifying smell. Inside, he discovered a hand and a woman's shoe protruding from plastic pellets and a strange green liquid. He immediately contacted local authorities. The body inside had been mummified due to the airtight seal of the drum. An autopsy determined that the victim was a woman aged between 25 and 30, who had died approximately 30 years earlier from blunt force trauma to the head, and was either Caucasian or Hispanic. They also found that the unknown woman was 9 months pregnant with the baby boy. The medical examiner noticed that she also had dental work done that was not typical for the U.S. She had 2 gold crowns, and that led him to believe that she had likely been from somewhere in South America. Along with the body, the plastic pellets, and the green liquid, the drum had contained a badly damaged pocketbook, a note, an address book, a plastic flower stem, some rings, and a locket that said, "To Patrice, love from Uncle Paul," engraved on it. The note and the address book were in poor condition and unreadable. They were sent to the forensic lab to be dried and examined using a video spectral comparator, which manipulates light to make writing on paper that is no longer visible to the naked eye readable. During this process, the Nassau County Homicide Squad investigated previous homeowners, as well as the origins of the drum. The house was built in 1957 and had only had 4 owners prior to the Cohen family: Howard Elkins, Arthur and Judith Evan, and Frank and Bernadette Samigi. With the exception of Howard Elkins, who denied any knowledge of the drum, all owners had said that they'd known that the drum was there, but had denied knowing anything about the origins or its contents. They just basically said it was there with the home. According to Arthur Evan, the second owner, he said, "We did roll it into the corner and forgot about it, and it was out of sight, out of mind for 12 years. Howard Elkins told the New York Times that in 1966, he'd had an addition built to the house that created the crawl space the drone was found in. But when asked if he'd ever been into the crawl space, he said, "What for?" He could not recall the contractor's name who did the addition, and added that there was no one else that would have had access to the property beyond gardeners, and Maids Police were also able to use a serial number on the drum to track down its origin to a chemical company in Linden, New Jersey. They were able to learn that the barrel had been made in March of '63 and was used for holding paint and plastic pigments. The company was also able to identify the green chemical as dye used for concrete and plastics, including the base of the fake plastic plants like the one found in the barrel. And the plastic pellets were the same that were used to make the plastic plants themselves. Using the reports of the previous homeowners and the information gathered from the chemical company, they were able to determine that the murder had occurred between 1963 and 1972, a period of time when Howard Elkins owned the home. The police also learned that Elkins had been a partial owner of Melrose Plastics, a company that manufactured big flowers and plants, which he sold in 1972 before he and his family moved to Florida. The police also received an anonymous phone call from someone who had heard about the case in the news. The tip confirmed that the dye was used at Melrose, and that it was rumored that Elkins was having an affair with a Hispanic woman who worked at the factory. On September 9th, Detective Sergeant Edwards of the Nassau County Police went to Boca Raton, Florida, to question Elkins, who was 71 at the time and living in a retirement home. Elkins admitted to having had a relationship with a woman from Melrose Plastics, but he couldn't give a name, a description, or explain the nature of the relationship. When they asked if they could do a DNA sample to do a paternity test for the fetus, Elkins refused and, according to Edwards, asked police to leave so he could discuss the matter with his wife privately when she returned home. At that point in time, he was not put into custody, but the detective said that they would come back with a warrant for his DNA. Detective Edwards then went to the West Palm Beach County District Attorney to obtain that warrant. But the next day, September 10th, Elkins was reported missing by his family. Before any warrant could be secured, he was found shortly after by his son in the garage of a neighbor's house. In the garage of a house Elkins was watching for a friend. Elkins had left the house and bought a shotgun and shot himself. No suicide note was found. Edwards said in an interview he didn't have a lot of options if he was arrested. He was a man in his 70s. What was he gonna do? Spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime that had happened 30 years before? I don't know what went through his mind, but obviously it was something he didn't want to face up to. DNA was collected from Elkins' remains, and although the fetus had deteriorated much over the years, forensic scientists were able to extract a sample, and the test proved a positive paternity with a 99.93% certainty that the father of the fetus was Elkins. Although they'd been able to determine the identity of the murderer, they still did not know the identity of the woman. All of Melrose Plastics' records had been destroyed, and tips had not been fruitful in securing any concrete information for the woman. At this point, forensic scientists had been able to gather a few names and numbers from the address book that had been found in the barrel. All of the numbers and addresses for people were no longer correct, except for one, Kathy Andrade. When police reached out to Kathy, she knew the identity of the woman in the barrel immediately. Kathy had been best friends with Reina Angelica American before her disappearance, and was able to fill in some of the blanks for authorities. Reina had moved to New York in August of 1966 from the city of San Martin and El Salvador. She was hoping for a fresh new start after her marriage had failed due to her husband getting another woman pregnant. She had dreams of becoming successful, often telling her mother that she was going to be somebody someday. Once she was in New York, she had taken up residence in a Catholic home for single women and got a job at Melrose Plastics making plastic flowers. She was also studying fashion at the High School of Fashion Industries, as well as taking classes to gain citizenship and learn English. Reina wrote back to her family often, detailing them of her new life in the U.S. Kathy was Reina's English teacher, which is how they met. She described Reina as full of life and eager to learn. She loved the city and often visited many museums. According to Kathy, Reina had started acting weird in the months leading up to her disappearance, and when she pressed Reina, she told Kathy that she was pregnant. Reina would not name the father, but she did tell Kathy that he was married and already had kids. He'd also set her up with a new apartment in New Jersey and with a private doctor. Reina said that she expected the man to marry her, but as her due date grew closer, she lost confidence that he would follow through. In desperation, Reina called the man's wife and told her that she was pregnant with her husband's baby. She then called Kathy in a panic, explaining what she had done and how the man had called her afterwards, saying that he was going to kill her. Kathy immediately went over to Reina's apartment, but she found no one there. According to her, the door was ajar, and there was warm food on the stove. It was winter, but Reina's coat, gloves, and boots were still there. Kathy waited roughly 4 hours before deciding to take the matter to police. The police told Kathy that Reina probably ran off with her boyfriend, and confirming that Kathy was not a relative, told her to come back in a week if she was still missing. 1969 was the last time anyone saw Reina alive. According to detectives, it is believed that Elkins had lured Reina to the factory after the phone call, where he'd beat her to death and then took her body back to his house in Long Island. They believe that after that, he decided to put her body in the barrel with plans of sinking her remains in the ocean, which is why he filled the drum with plastic pellets, making sure that it was heavy enough to sink. It is then presumed that he overestimated the weight, and after sealing the container, he found it was too heavy to move. So instead, he pushed the barrel into the new crawl space and left it there. Oscar Corral, a reporter for the News Daily, was covering the case and flew to El Salvador to find Reina's family. He learned that her mother was still alive, and after finding her, she burst into tears as he explained why he was there. She was 95. After Reina had left, she had stayed in contact with her family, writing to them often, until one day the letters stopped. According to Dora Marroquin, Reina's sister, they had put out announcements in El Salvadorian papers in hopes that someone might know something. Before Coral, they had all generally accepted that they would never know what happened to Reina, but her mother had reported about having nightmares of Reina being stuck inside a barrel. All we want is to bring her body back, and my mother, who is 95 years old, will finally be able to put her daughter to rest. My sister is with us. We will never forget her, said Dora. The body was flown back to El Salvador for burial. Her mother passed away a month later, and they were buried beside each other. The forensic scientists were able to determine what was written on the note inside the barrel. It read, "Don't be mad. I told the truth." Naomi Chaney was born on September 20th, 1918 in Jasper, Alabama. She graduated from high school in Pensacola, Florida before continuing her studies at Florida State College for Women. She taught high school for one term after graduating from college in 1942, but then decided she wanted to be a part of the war effort. Naomi therefore enlisted in the Women's Army Corps and was sent to Fort Des Moines, where she entered officer school on April 26, 1943. She received her officer's commission on June 5th. That September, she was transferred to the School of the Army Air Forces Training Command in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She arrived there on September 4th. On October 5th, 1943, Lieutenant Cheney had dinner at the base's officers' club. She then went to visit her roommate who was in the hospital on the base. Lieutenant Cheney did not leave the base until 9 o'clock that evening, well after it had gotten dark. She and her roommate had just moved into a home at 525 South Euclid Avenue 2 days earlier from another home in town. It was common practice for civilians to rent out rooms to board service members in their homes at the time due to the rapid increase in personnel assigned to the base because of the war. Her walk home from the base should have taken her roughly 25 minutes. Lieutenant Janney left the base through gate number 3, which opened onto what is today called Burnside Street, but at the time was northwest, near its intersection with Western Avenue. Before leaving, she asked the guard at the gate if he thought she would be safe walking home in the dark. He told her she would have to use her own judgment. After weighing her options for a few minutes, Lieutenant Cheney left the base and began walking home. A cab driver would later report having seen her a short time later, just down the road near the intersection of Northwest and 6th Street. The lieutenant did not report to the base the following morning and was classified as being absent without leave. Military police went to the home where she was staying to try to find her, but she was not there. They became concerned when Lieutenant Cheney could still not be found by that afternoon. Around 5 p.m. that day, a 10-year-old girl named Val Hall was out looking for sumac leaves in a wooded area not far from her home. She came across a woman lying motionless in the middle of a path in a thicket underneath a viaduct crossing the train tracks near 12th Street and Grange Avenue. The woman was Lieutenant Cheney, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would later estimate she had died approximately 18 hours earlier. Her body was found less than 3 blocks from her home. Lieutenant Cheney's autopsy determined that she had died as a result of a crushing blow to the right side of her head, which had resulted in numerous skull fractures and brain hemorrhages. The exact location of her body made it impossible for her to have fallen or been thrown from the viaduct. She had not sexually assaulted, and there was no evidence that such an assault was even attempted. Her uniform was intact and only slightly rumpled. One of her shoes was, however, scuffed and had its toe box crushed as though someone had stomped on the lieutenant's foot. Her visor cap was found not far from her body, as was her purse, which still had cash inside of it, seemingly eliminating robbery as a potential motive in the crime. 2 doctors did debate the nature of Lieutenant Cheney's death at the coroner's jury convened to evaluate it. Dr. Garundo, an associate professor of pathology at the University of South Dakota, argued that the lieutenant had not been murdered and that her injuries had been caused by her skull being run over by a car. He claimed that his examination of her vocal cords showed that she had not screamed prior to her death and argued she would have screamed had she been attacked. Even if his examination was able to definitively prove that Lieutenant Cheney had not screamed, there is no way to prove that she had not been ambushed by a killer, which seems like a probable scenario given the fact that her body showed few signs of a struggle and no signs that she had been restrained. Dr. Garundo used these facts to instead further try to support his claim that no murder had occurred. The area where the lieutenant was found was not accessible by car. Dr. Garundo argued that she had still been able to walk after sustaining the massive head injury. There was no reported blood evidence at the scene beyond the large pool underneath Lieutenant Cheney's head, meaning she would have had to make the long walk with the serious wound without dripping any blood on the ground or down her uniform in Dr. Garundo's scenario. Arguing that Lieutenant Cheney had been murdered was Dr. Erickson, a Sioux Falls surgeon who had assisted with her autopsy. He pointed out that if the lieutenant had been hit by a car, she would most likely have more extensive injuries and damage to her uniform. He also claimed that the head injury was too severe for her to have walked at all after sustaining it, much less to have walked to the area where she was found, so far away from anywhere accessible by car. His assessment of her injuries was that they were caused by the lieutenant's head either being struck with a blunt object or being stomped or kicked while she was on the ground. The jury was convinced by Dr. Erickson's testimony, and Lieutenant Cheney's death was officially ruled a homicide. On October 6th, authorities brought a suspect into custody as he was trying to leave town. The 31-year-old man, whose name has never been made public, had a wife and children in Iowa but worked as a farmhand throughout the region. While in Sioux Falls, He had been staying at a cabin at Smith's Auto Court, not far from where Lieutenant Cheney's body had been found. He was brought in because authorities had discovered blood-matted hair near his cabin. When the suspect was questioned, he also had blood on his shoe. He theorized that the blood had gotten onto the shoe as he walked through grass that morning. However, the blood was on the top of the shoe, not on the sole. The FBI was able to determine that the blood from the suspect's shoe and matted hair was the same type as Lieutenant Cheney's blood, but the technology of the time could not more conclusively tie the evidence to her. The suspect maintained his innocence and was released on October 27th as authorities had no other evidence to implicate him in the murder. At the time, he was in the process of joining the army. After he enlisted, he was sent overseas and was killed in action. City and military police both worked on the case, traveling the country to conduct interviews and consulting with psychics Lieutenant Cheney had visited before her death. The Army offered a $1,000 reward in the case at the beginning of 1944, but none of these efforts brought resolution to the case. The murder of Lieutenant Cheney remains the oldest unsolved homicide in Sioux City. In 2004, Wife Swap USA took to the screens. Originally starting in the UK a year prior, the format was a success, and the reality show soon traveled overseas to be picked up by ABC. The premise was simple. Two different households, usually with dramatically different lifestyles, swapped wives and her mothers or sometimes husbands and her fathers over. They would spend 1 week playing by the family's rules, and then the second week with the family playing by the rules of whoever had joined, before reuniting with their own families to discuss the experience. 4 years into the show airing in America in 2008, viewers around the world were introduced to the Stockdale family. ABC producers were searching for a bluegrass family band specifically, and one that held strong faith-based traditional values. ABC found what they were looking for with the Stockdale family. The Stockdales consisted of Mother Kathy, age 44, Father Tim, age 48, and their children, 19-year-old Calvin, Charles, who is 16, 15-year-old Jacob, and the youngest son, James, who is 11 at the time. It's said that despite Kathy and Tim being initially reluctant to want to participate in the show, the 4 boys were eager for the experience. And eventually, the family decided to take the ABC producers upon their offer. Kathy and Tim had moved from the big city to a secluded and rural area in a village called Beach City in Stark County, Ohio, to raise their 4 sons. They lived on a farm on Dolphin Street, southwest in Bethlehem Township. Tim worked a full-time job, leaving the house every day at 5:30 a.m., and Kathy stayed at the farm to homeschool the children. The Stockdales were a deeply religious family, and Kathy said they had moved up to the farm to develop wholesome family values, and she and Tim wanted to protect their sons and keep them sheltered. Each person participating in the swap has to leave a list of rules that acts almost as a manual and explains the family's dynamics. In this extensive write-up, Kathy explained that the children were banned from watching TV, playing video games, listening to music unless it was approved by Kathy and Tim, and they weren't allowed to date. "I have never been on a date," 16-year-old Jacob said on the show. "There's better ways to find out about girls than dating." The children were homeschooled so Kathy, in her own words, could control their character and education away from any influences of other students or teachers. She said that they ate breakfast at the same time every day, but if her boys were not on time, she would give them 2 minutes to arrive and then charge them 25 cents for being late. In order to earn privileges in the house, the boys had to complete chores to get tokens, which would go onto a chart on the wall. They could then exchange the tokens for things like listening to a family-approved radio show. By all intents and purposes, the family lived a fairly secluded life, having each other for company. Kathy said, "Life is not about entertainment and fun. I do not promote a lot of leisure time for the boys. A lot of emphasis in the teen world is placed on hanging out with friends. We do not hang out. I insist that the boys have a focus and a purpose to any activity so that the boys do not become corrupted by meaningless relationships." She said that although she was raising her boys in a much stricter environment than her parents had raised her in, she felt it was for the best, given how times had changed. And ultimately, as a family, they believed that spending time together without anything interfering was the most important thing. The boys were very musically gifted and played in a bluegrass band with their dad, Tim. The band had elements of gospel and comedy as well, and they would often compete in regional competitions and perform at bluegrass gatherings. They were all undoubtedly very talented, and the family said they enjoyed any chance to play and make music together. Tim said it was a good way to teach the children about working together and for them to earn some money. Kathy would act as the band's manager, and together, the band produced 4 albums. The Stockdales swapped with the Tonkovic family, who couldn't have been more different. Lori Tonkovic attempted to change things up by giving the brothers more freedom, but she was met with fierce resistance. Lori said, "When I switched the rules and I was going to let them have fun, let them have television and video games, and experience life a little bit, Jacob ran outside crying. And when I went out after him, I asked him what was wrong, and he said that his mom and dad would tell him he would burn in hell." After the wife swap experience was over, by all accounts, things seemed to carry on as normal for the Stockdale family. They continued to perform with the boys, often winning competitions for their music, and they carried on working on the family farm. Almost a decade later, however, Calvin and Charles had moved out of the house and area. They had also officially left the family band, although they did still play music with them in the home whenever they returned to visit. Calvin began working at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and Charles was studying to be a doctor in Philadelphia. 21-year-old James was studying business at university and was hoping to go into the business side of managing the family band. Kathy was still regularly uploading to her YouTube channel, which often showed the boys performing and getting up to various activities. Her last upload was on March 23, 2017, and showed her youngest son, James, in the snow making jokes and kidding around. The members of the Stockdale band, which were now Tim, Jacob, and James, and a family friend, Joe Steiner, were still finding a decent amount of success, and the band was completely booked up throughout the summer. The Stockdales attended a musical gathering with other family members and friends during the month of June, and one witness recalled that Jacob left early due to not feeling well. In mid-June, they performed at the Wildcat Ranch in Ohio. Nothing seemed amiss, and everything appeared as it normally was. At 4:36 p.m., police received a call. They could hear nothing, and whoever was on the end of the line swiftly hung up. Whoever made that call remains unclear. When authorities arrived at the location the call had come from, residents alerted them to gunshots that had been heard near the Stockdale family farm. Neighbors said they had heard between 10 and 12 shots sometime between 1 and 3 p.m. As police approached the property, they saw the door was open and a figure was standing inside. They then heard a single gunshot. They found 25-year-old on the floor with a gunshot wound to the head. He was bleeding profusely but was still alive. Upstairs in the bathroom, they found 54-year-old Kathy. 21-year-old James was discovered near a door. Both of them were deceased, having died from gunshot wounds that had come from a 20-gauge shotgun, the same one found with Jacob. Jacob had taken the gun from the home, shot his mother and brother, then turned the gun on himself. Tim was out of the house at the time, as were Calvin and Charles. Calvin said, "James, our youngest brother, has always been a catalyst of family fun. He leaves behind many friends and a family that loved him dearly. My brother Jacob is still in critical condition, and we are praying for his physical recovery as our family makes funeral plans and begins the healing process." He also said that, as a family, they love him and forgive him. A grieving Tim said, "Kathy has been my beloved wife of 32 years and a wonderful mother to our 4 sons. She loved nothing more than being a mother and grandmother. She had a strong sense of learning and was passionate about her Christian faith, natural health, and organic farming." Jacob stayed in hospital for over a year, receiving numerous surgeries, including reconstructive and extensive treatment for his severe brain injuries. He had lost all sight in his left eye and was living with at least 7 metal fragments permanently lodged in his head. In September 2018, after over a year of treatments and medical care, Jacob was charged with 2 counts of murder, and he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. A grand jury decided not to apply the death penalty in his case. In January 2019, Jacob attended a short hearing with his defense attorney, and his attorney requested a psychological evaluation of his client. After this, Jacob was placed in Heartland Behavioral Healthcare Hospital, a secure state psychiatric facility, because he was deemed not mentally competent to stand trial. He was assessed several times, but due to the brain damage after attempting to take his own life, the results were often differing. He tried to escape from the hospital twice, first in November 2019 by hiding in between book stacks, and a month later when he was caught trying to blend in with people walking out of the institution. A doctor who had been asked to assess Jacob said he was confident that after a year of treatment in Heartland Healthcare, he should be competent to stand trial. The trial was still proving tough to get started for various reasons. Delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic had pushed everything back, and Jacob's complete silence during the hearings meant it was even harder to move forward. Dr. Wood was sent in to assess Jacob. Due to hospital policies and COVID-19 restrictions, hearings and legal meetings were taking place over Zoom, but Dr. Wood was asked to go in person to talk to Jacob. Jacob was still not participating or answering questions, but after a long assessment, she eventually found him to have been clinically sane at the time of the murders. After this, the trial was finally able to move forward. It was originally set for the January 26, 2021, but because of the restrictions due to the pandemic, this prohibited Jacob's attorney from meeting with him in person at the mental health facility. The defense requested a delay on legal proceedings, citing inability to adequately prepare for the trial. Judge Frank Fortune allowed this and pushed the trial back to May 4, 2021. During this time, professionals inside Heartland Healthcare believed that Jacob was fit to leave the hospital and be moved to jail. Jacob had been keeping on top of his medications and participating in group therapy sessions and activities and seemed to be making big improvements. His defense attorneys argue that these improvements, however, proved that he needed to stay inside the hospital to continue making these positive steps, and they were worried that if he left, it would cause more harm to him and set him back. As the May trial loomed, the defense could no longer go with the insanity plea originally put forward, so they ultimately went with a guilty plea in the hopes it may result in a reduced sentence. A week before it was due to commence, the now 27-year-old Jacob Stockdale appeared before Judge Frank Fortune, who had been presiding since the start. He entered a plea of guilty to the murders of his mother Kathy and his younger brother James. The two firearm specifications were dismissed. The judge now had the task of sentencing him. At the sentencing hearing, Jacob's family declined to speak personally, but they gave a prepared statement to the chief prosecutor. Our family grieves the loss of Catherine Barbara Stockdale and James William Stockdale. Kathy was a loving mother, grandmother, daughter, sister, aunt, mentor, and friend to many. James was a loving son, brother, nephew, uncle, cousin, and friend to many. Kathy put all her efforts into homeschooling all four sons through their graduation from high school. Losing her encouraging words and comforting hugs has been devastating. James was a college student and dedicated musician, bringing smiles to all. While Jacob has no recollection of the events of that day, he trusts the legal system to do the right thing. It's beyond our understanding why this act was committed. One of the Stockdale brothers added, "We love you and forgive you for the role that you had in their deaths to the degree that we are capable of knowing the hearts of Mom and James. We are convinced that they also forgive you for taking their lives." The letter went on to say that the family was so grateful to the first responders who had helped save Jacob's life that afternoon. The Stockdales requested that the judge be lenient and give Jacob the lightest sentence possible. His father, Tim, who had been at every single hearing, said, "My sons and I continue to love Jacob." The judge sentenced Jacob to 15 years for each murder to run consecutively. He said, "I have to protect the public, and the nature of these charges are so gruesome. You will serve the next 30 years to life in prison." It is unconfirmed as to whether or not there is a parole eligibility date for Jacob, but if he serves out his full sentence, he'll be almost 60 when it comes time for release. Although the reasons behind everything that happened that day remains unconfirmed, many people, along with Lori Tonkovic, who switched with Kathy on Wife Swap, believes that the strictness and pressures of the Stockdale household pushed Jacob to the extreme. That being said, what happened inside the Stockdale family home that day will never be fully known. The small glimpse we got into Stockdale's home life isn't enough to paint a complete picture of the family and their dynamic. There is a lot of speculation and rumors about why this came to be, how it happened, and what prompted it. But whatever happened and why, it is still a devastating ordeal for everyone involved in this case. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.